Good morning, everybody. We're delighted to be able to join you today for our first Teams Live event for Open House Melbourne. I'm Ann Carew, the Curatorial Officer of the RMIT Design Archives, and I'm here with Simone Rule, Archives Officer, and Professor Harriet Edquist. We've also got Paula Towle, Head of RMIT Culture, with us as well today, and you'll meet her a bit later. We're going to take you on a tour of the building, give you some information about the archives, and show you some highlights from the architectural collections. There'll be a Q&A halfway through our session today. Please log into the Q&A facility and pop any questions you have for us in there. We'll be delighted to answer them. Now, next slide, please, Simone. Here we are standing at the corner of Queensbury and Bouverie Street in Carlton. And in the front of this slide, you can just see the former CUB site. I don't know whether you can spot the archives, but you can see definitely the main design hub building, which is on Melbourne's Civic Spine on the corner of Swanston Street. It's also our home. This photograph was taken not long after the building was completed in 2012 by Earl Carter. Since then, two new towers obscure this view. There's the ARM Barrack building, and also just recently completed Alan Burke Fraser's Swanston Central campus. Now I'm going to pass you over to Harriet Edquist, who's going to do an acknowledgement of country for us before we begin our tour. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome everyone to this virtual tour of our collections. And before we start, we always like to acknowledge where we've come from and where we are. And the RMIT Design Archives, where we work normally, stands on the traditional and the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And respectfully, we acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thanks, Anne.
So here we are now standing in Victoria Street, looking back at the Design Hub complex. The small drawing in the window there is by the architect Sean Godsell, and this photo again was taken when the building first opened. Our entry is the doorway just next to that cantilevered window. Building 100 now accommodates the School of Architecture and Urban Design, as well as the RMIT Design Archives and the Design Hub Gallery. It's an award-winning building designed by Sean Godsell in association with Peddlethorpe and Learmonth. The Archives is a three-storey facility, so we're looking at it at ground level, and the 3 stories are below ground level. It accommodates the Archives collections, the staff, and it's also used for public events. It's readily identifiable by its skin on the main Design Hub building, which you can see on the right of your screen. That comprises 17,000 semi-translucent glass discs. The original intention was for them to be retrofitted at some stage to with solar technology, so that one day the building might power itself. In more recent times, a bank at the rear of the building has been retrofitted and gathers solar energy. The model for this building is held in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the design generally reflects the history of RMIT University as a working man's college, with its sort of concrete, galvanised steel, rubber, and used extensively throughout the building. So now I'm going to welcome Simone, and Simone's going to take us, oh, actually, no, I think I'm doing the next slide. So we're going inside the building now. Now this is actually street level. It's called we call it level 3, and this room is the permanent store. Here we have plan files to store architectural drawings. We've got archive boxes with photographs and manuscripts. On the wall, you can see a photograph by Wolfgang Sievers of the Eater factory. And just in the very foreground of this image, you can see a drawing by Phil Simons, which is a recent acquisition to the collection. This picture was taken during open house last year. So when we have tours of the building, we often spill out into this area too to host visitors. We've also in this area got magazines and journals, a small library for design research. I'm just going to give you a brief history of the RDA now. RMIT is focused on design education really since its inception as the Working Man's College in 1887. And this is very much reflected in the RDA's programs and our collections. The motto of the university is a skilled hand and a cultivated mind. We collect broadly the archives of 20th century Melbourne designers and design practices. And Harriet's going to talk a little bit about this later on in our presentation. Our history stretches back to 1994 when a textile resource centre was set up at the university by Professor Janet Mead, who was head of fashion and textiles. That same year, Prue Acton donated an archive to the university. It was jointly donated to us and to the Museum of Victoria. Then in 1997, we received a very generous bequest in memory of Francis Burke, and the Textile Resource Centre was renamed the Francis Burke Textile Resource Centre. Francis Burke was a celebrated textile designer who's well known in Melbourne. Then in 2007, it was decided to expand the remit of the Textile Centre and introduce all design disciplines into the collections that had been taught over the years at RMIT. We moved into our purpose-built building in 2012. Now, Simone is going to take you down to level 2 and tell you a little bit about what happens on that level of the building.
Thank you, Anne. As Anne said, I'm the Archives Officer here, and as one of the collections care staff in the archive, I thought I'd give a little bit of a talk about what we collect. We estimate we have over 250,000 objects in the archive, which represent around over 1,300 creators and designers. We collect across a range of disciplines, including architecture, automotive design, fashion and textile design, furniture design, graphic and communication design, industrial and product design, interior design, and landscape design, just to name a few. So with such a diverse range of objects collections, it's a diverse range of objects, and each of those have different needs that we have to work together to collect and take care of. So now we're on level 2 of the building, and this is where myself and the others collection staff process objects which come into the archive, like this amazing suit made out of tea towels for graphic designer Mimo Cozzolino, which you can see pictured on the left. That was an acquisition from last year. When objects come in, we inventory and catalogue them and then rehouse them in boxes like ones you can see stored behind on the shelves, behind in the background of the photos. On the right, we have a photo of one of our previous volunteers, Emily. She was a conservation student, and here she is checking the condition of some of the illustrations of Alfredo Beret. We have a few students who come and do work placement with us each year, and we help them build their skills in archiving and collections care. And moving down to level 1, this is one of our storage rooms. So our rooms are temperature and humidity controlled to help keep a stable environment for the longevity of the objects. And as we deal with a lot of paper and two-dimensional objects, we like to store them flat as possible. And we've got pictured here Harriet, who is holding a drawing of RMIT Building 8 by Edmund and Corrigan. And as you can see, it's stored quite flat in one of our plan drawers, which we store a lot of our architecture and our big graphic design posters. Other smaller objects we store in boxes and folders on shelves, like the compactor shelving behind Harriet in that photo. The other photo is again a volunteer of ours, Ryan, who was with us a couple of years back, and he's rehousing animation cells from the film Grendel, 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 which was by Alex Stitt, who was a graphic designer and better known for his work on the Life Be In It campaign. Behind Ryan, you can see a scanner and a computer, because this room is also not just a storage room, but also our digitisation room, and that little corner is where we scan and photograph the collection. A large part of my job is making the collections accessible in various means through the collections website and in pre-COVID times through research visits. When we are normally open, the collection is available for anyone to make an appointment to visit. You don't have to be an academic researcher to ask to come and view objects. Of course, due to COVID, we haven't had proper access to the archives since March, and we've been working at home instead behind the scenes to get the collection database as robust and with as much information in there as possible. We have over 12,500 records online and 230 inventories which you can search and explore. And while you can't visit physically, I can still provide research material digitally if you request it. So I encourage you after this to visit our website and explore the collection a bit deeper. So now we'll go back up to level 2 and I'll hand you over to Harriet, who will talk about our active archive space.
Thanks, Simone. This is an interesting space. It's, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a double height glazed room with north and west facing walls. So it gets quite hot in summer, but it is our, if you like, our public facing space. And when in 2007, it was decided that the Design Archives would be housed on this site. The Design Hub building was in the process of being designed by Shaw and Godsell architects. And the decision was made by the Vice-Chancellor at the time that because we were a research hub ourselves and that the Design Hub building was dedicated to design research at that stage, that we would join them on this site. And we, the staff at the time, spent a lot of time with Shaw and Godsell architects going through our very specific requirements for this building. So we got really a building that was very much suited to our needs. And those needs, we saw them really based around workflow. It's how to get collections in and out of the building, how to move them through the building into the loading bay, get them housed and put into storage and then accessed again. So it was a very practical and pragmatic sort of process we went through. And in the beginning, this process is what was embodied in the building that Godsell designed. But a little bit later, this room emerged, and it has really made the archives, I think, a very special place, because rather than us sort of ferreting around in the wombat sort of warren downstairs guarding our treasures, we can bring them out and show them to our various communities on various occasions, to our researchers, to the public, and we can celebrate what we do. This is a great party room. We have parties here as well as everything else. So it has really been an extraordinary addition to what was initially a very pragmatically designed archive around, as I say, around workflow and practical things that we do in terms of collecting and maintaining collections. And I'll just back to Anne now, is it, or Simone?
I might just let you know what you're looking at here in these pictures. On the left-hand side, we've got Mimo Cozzolino with an intern from the Powerhouse Museum. Mimo has been a great donor and friend to the archives, and on this occasion he came in to help us identify and interpret his collections. And so there he is, and we actually, you can see on screen there, we've got a little audio because we recorded him as well. And we have very strong and close relationships with many of our donors, And we're very, grateful for the time they spend with us in the archive, assisting us with the documentation of their collections. And that project resulted in a new narrative for Mimo Cozzolino's collection, which you can read on our collection highlights page. On the other side was a terrific project, which was the first of our projects with students from the Exhibiting and Curating Design program in the Masters of Communication at RMIT. And these particular students, this exhibition was called Archivia. So the students came into the archive for several classes and then looked in depth at aspects of the collection and produced objects, new objects related to the design practice that they'd chosen. In this case, it's Alex Stitt, and these three students were overwhelmed by Alex Stitt's output, his creativity, his multifaceted involvement in design. And so what they decided to do is make a portrait of Alex Stitt. And this portrait's actually, it had QR codes embedded in it, so people could go up to the image and get a direct link to a particular item held in the Design Archives collection. They also made these T-shirts and the floor decal. And in the background of that photograph, I've just realised we've got another graphic designer, David Lancashire, standing. And he's also been a fantastic supporter of the archive and of our student programs. With these students in particular, it's wonderful when the actual practitioner comes in and is able to celebrate their contributions and the students' work. It means a lot to the students. So now I think we're ready to see whether we've got any questions from the audience. And so far we don't have any questions, but perhaps some of our other participants might have questions. No?
Oh, we just have a question here.
Oh, how can I visit the archive?
Yes, so if you go to our website, you will see there is a link for research visits, and there's a form there which you can fill in and ask us what you'd like to see, and I can help you out with making that available to you.
I can ask a question. Can you hear me, Anne?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Roger.
Yes, it's Roger Benjamin from the University of Sydney, and calling from Sydney. How do you deal with gathering your materials as opposed to other archives that might want them, such as the Powerhouse Museum up in Sydney? There you go, a Melbourne-Sydney question. Harriet.
Oh, sorry. I might answer that one, Roger. Well, it's quite good, really, because when we established this this facility, and I was very particular about this because there are a lot of collecting institutions around the country and in Melbourne, and so we were very particular about setting up a collecting institution that didn't really tread on anyone else's toes. And it didn't tread on the gallery or the museum, and actually the closest is the Powerhouse, of course. But the other thing is that we really focus on Melbourne and Victoria.
Yes.
So there's been very few instances where, in fact, I can only think of one, and that was local, where we've really, there's been any sort of argy-bargy about who gets what collection. And I think we've steered a very particular path through the collecting domain to construct a very clear collecting policy and a vision for what we do. And so it doesn't really, I might be wrong here, but it doesn't really affect, I think, other collecting institutions with whom I have to say we get on really well. I mean, we do a lot of collaborative work with the State Library, with the National Gallery of Victoria, with Melbourne Museum, and with interstate collecting facilities as well. So it was really setting up something at the beginning that we didn't think would upset the more established, long-standing collecting institutions.
Great.
We've got another question here, which I'll read out, and perhaps Harriet might like to answer this question. Are there any design elements in the building that were added after the fact to accommodate the Design Archives needs?
No, not that I can think of. I mean,
no. The building was.
It was bespoke. I mean, we gave the architects floor plans with every single element on it that we wanted, and we pretty much got exactly what we wanted. I mean, there was very little difference between what we asked for and what we got. So, as I say, the atrium was the big standout. We didn't ask for that. In our wildest dreams, we never thought we'd ask for an enormous space, you know, that is just so wonderful. But the actual, you know, the nitty-gritty of the place where we collect and work and store, that was pretty much what we asked for.
Well, I've got some wonderful questions coming along here, but perhaps we'll start, Simone. What kind of research materials do we have? Would you like to answer that, Simone?
Yes, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next half of this, but we largely collect the design process. So it's all of those sort of background materials, whether it be correspondence, design drawings, photographs, a lot of really ephemeral pieces, rather than collecting much of the finished objects themselves. We like to see how they came to be or how they didn't come to be, because some of my favourite things are the buildings or the objects that were never actually created and never happened, and those stories in themselves are also interesting about why that didn't happen. So yeah, that's the type of research materials that we collect.
Now, just following on from that quick question, we've been asked what is the most prized possession of the Design Archives. And I think we will all struggle to answer that.
Yeah.
I think that can vary depending on which archive you're looking at, and you have these moments where you think, my goodness, do we really have this document? And what an interesting insight that is into a practice. I didn't know anything about it. I mean, obviously there are things that are very much loved. I've posted on Instagram today a picture of Mimo Cozzolino's Melbourne tram folio case. And it's not one of our most prized possessions, possibly, but it's one of our most loved possessions. Unusual things can appeal to people. We have a wonderful collection of work by Geoffrey Woodfull, which Stuart King is going to speak about later after 12 o'clock today as part of the journal launch. And every time I put anything like that up on Instagram, it's just absolutely adored. So, but what about you, Harriet? Would you have an observation about prized possessions?
Well, I'm like you. I mean, there's so many remarkable things in there, but one of the things that I guess I do really like as a historian is the correspondence. And it's very valuable. And so, for example, in the Grounds Romberg and Boyd archive, well, it's actually the personal archive of Frederick Romberg, but it does incorporate work from Grounds Romberg and Boyd office. We have letters between the principals of that office and others in the office, and they are extraordinarily valuable when you're looking at the design development of a building. And in fact, Roger Benjamin later on will talk about his work on the architect Alex Jelinek, and he had access to letters between Jelinek and the client, and they really are remarkable. And Edmund and Corrigan's collection has a lot of correspondence, including ancient faxes, which is so faded. You just look at these documents like some sort of hieroglyphic. And I remember when we got one of our collections valued last year, I think it was, or perhaps the year before, the
Marion Fletcher.
Thank you, the Marion Fletcher collection. That the valuer said that what he found remarkable about it was her correspondence. He thought it was one of the most remarkable collections of a designer's correspondence in the country. So those things, to me, when you're really trying to tease out how particularly client-designer relationships, which I really find fascinating. Those documents to me are some of our really great treasures.
And what about you, Simone?
For me, these days, I actually think it's our documentation of manufacturing processes, like our photographs and films of factory floors, things that don't exist. A lot of that industrial production that doesn't exist in Australia anymore, I think, is a really wonderful record of the past for me.
Okay. Now, I think we do have one more question which we might answer towards the end. It's a terrific question about the design ideology behind the translucent glass discs, but I think we do need to move on now to the next slide, and Simone is going to guide us there, and Harriet actually.
Well, do you want me to do it or you, Simone?
Simone can start, perhaps.
I can start. I was just going to talk a little about the types of objects we collect. And so, as I was, people were asking before about what sort of research material we have. As we're an archive and not a museum, we focus less on the finished object and instead talk about the process, the design drawings, the correspondence, and those decisions which lead up to the production or non-production of a finished design. And all those decisions around why design isn't completed, for me, are a really interesting insight into society at the time and all those social and political influences and how they can affect things getting created or not created. I think I'll pass on to Harriet to possibly talk about maybe the research value of those collections.
Thanks, Simone. I think that the point that you made there, Simone, is really worth reiterating, that we're not a museum. Now, museums and art galleries collect objects for quite different reasons. They're based often on rarity, on their perceived social, cultural values, and they're often one-offs. And they belong to a whole history of connoisseurship that gives that object value. Now, archives historically are records of institutions. For example, the parliamentary archives or legal archives. They're very important instruments of state, if you like. A design archive isn't obviously quite as important as that, but it's important to recognise that what we try to do is to keep records of practice. Now, in terms of architecture, I think we've got 12, 13 architecture collections. Some of them are tiny, and some of them, like this one we're looking at here from the Edmund and Corrigan collection, are vast. I mean, it's 600 boxes and counting, I think, with this one. And what you can see here are a range of objects in that collection. For example, sketches of Building 8 and a couple of houses that Edmund and Corrigan designed up there on the top left. Now, just in terms of documenting a building, there are all sorts of different kinds of drawings that we would collect there, from early sketches, just ideation, through to the presentation drawings to the client, to contract drawings, to working drawings. In Edmund and Corrigan, we've got the working drawings, but also the amendments to the working drawings as they were going through the build process, and so on. So there's a whole range of different types of professional drawings that in an archive such as this we will collect, and through those you can trace the entire history of the build of a particular building. We've also got illustrations that Peter Corrigan commissioned Robert Pierce to illustrate one of his houses, the Barber House there you can see on the top right. We have a few models. This is a working model of Newman College down on the bottom left, and Anne particularly likes these objects. The glasses, the plastic glasses that Barry Kosky, the very well-known Melbourneian theatre designer who's now based in Berlin, he sent out to his friends as his invitation to his 30th birthday. And on the right there is Jenny Bannister's design for Clarence Chai for a garment that Peter Corrigan bought for Maggie Edmund in 1978. So this gives you an idea of the range of objects that might appear in one collection. But what's really important about that is the way, because we just focus on Melbourne, really post-war design, we don't go back into deep history. The collections sort of talk to each other. So, for example, that Robert Pearce illustration, Robert Pearce was a very famous, very well-known Melbourne graphic designer, and we have his archive. So that relates then to this other archive. For example, the Jenny Bannister garment relates to our fashion and textile archives, which are quite extensive. Now, the Barry Kosky glasses, we don't have a theatre archive, but of course we do have some of Peter Corrigan's theatre work in our collection. The rest, I think, is in the Performing Arts Museum and elsewhere in Australia. But we do have, in fact, some theatre work by Kevin Greenhatch, so that there is a tiny little theatre cluster that might then develop around those glasses. So in a way, each collection, the objects in it can also relate horizontally right through the archives to other collections.
Thank you, Harriet. Moving on, the next collection I wanted to talk about was Mcrae House in Dromana, which was designed in 1955 by Chancellor and Patrick. The Mcrae family called it Larrakia, but you more likely know it as Butterfly House because of its beautiful shape. In 2013, the family donated the house itself to RMIT University, and it's now used for writing residencies. And the archive of the house design came to us at the Design Archives. And part of that archive is a series of home movies, like this one here of the house being built. It's just an excerpt, but I think it really gives a wonderful insight into how it was constructed and the more relaxed OH&S of the day, such as smoking whilst welding, which you'll see coming up. This gentleman here with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And also interesting things like how they got the structure up using just ropes, I also thought was really interesting. And then just tying the ropes to a tree and hoping that would all hold itself up. We have a number of audiovisual pieces in the collection, some of which are available to watch, like this one, and others which we still need to digitise and make accessible, but they are just a lovely part of the collection, these movies. I really love them. There's another one which is just a family movie and another one of their rabbiting business as well.
My goodness, that's such a fantastic resource. It
is wonderful, movie. Isn't it? It is really, really
unusual.
It is great. The whole thing goes for 16 minutes, but I didn't want to share all 16 minutes. I thought I'd cut it down to a nice little highlights. I'll now pass back to Harriet, who will talk a little bit about Ernest Fuchs, who designed here the Malvern Victory supermarket, and then I'll come back and talk a bit more about the supermarket itself. Harriet?
Okay, thanks, Simone. This is really interesting, and as I said, one of the ways, well, I probably didn't say actually, but in our architecture collection, when you look at what we've collected around certain themes and certain nodes, if you like. And the first, I think, major architectural collection to come into the archives was, as I said, Frederick Romberg's personal collection. Now, Frederick was an emigre architect. He was actually born in China, but he was German and came out here in 1938. And the experience of the emigre, when I was working on Romberg many years ago, and in fact, Michael Spooner and I and Stephen Banham, you'll meet later on, all worked together on a Romberg project. And it was very evident there, the particular issues and that relate to emigre architects who come out here and establish practices in quite new conditions and in new countries. And around that archive, we've collected particularly emigre architects and designers. We've now got a very strong, well, it's quite small, but a very strong collection in emigre design, and it's used a great deal because this is a theme that historians now are totally on top of and are using a lot. Now, Ernest Fuchs was actually born in what is now the Czech Republic, but like a lot of people in what was then the Holy Roman, no, not the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian, sorry, my history is getting very confused, Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family moved to Vienna when he was a little boy, and he grew up in Vienna, and he trained as an architect in Vienna at the Technical University. He had extraordinarily brilliant training there, and he did his doctorate studies on town planning. And he went into practice in the early 30s in Vienna during the heyday of what we call Red Vienna, when the socialist government was building all this workers' housing, and he was involved in that. It was very heady days. And of course, he had, being a Jew, they were forced to leave Vienna when things became far too difficult for Jewish people to stay. And he and his wife, Noemi, eventually came to Melbourne in 1939. He immediately got a job with the Housing Commission of Victoria because of his excellent credentials as a town planner. And then after the war, he established himself in private practice and had an extraordinarily prolific private practice, particularly in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. It was mainly residential, but what's very interesting, what researchers now are showing, is how he and a lot of, well, not a lot, but a number of other architects, immigrate architects like him, had an enormous impact on the development of our suburbs, not only just in the spread of the suburbs, but also in the typologies, the architectural types that they developed. And one of those was the walk-up flats, so-called six-pack flats that Fuchs really excelled in, and they're very highly prized now as very good, workable, medium density housing, which of course we're all looking to models for how to do that today. And these really provide excellent models. But there are other new types. After post-war, Australia started to build again in the 1950s and develop new modernist types for the new suburbs. And one of those, of course, was a supermarket. And I'll hand you back to Simone, who will talk about this particular supermarket.
Thanks, Harriet. So we've got here the Melbourne Victory supermarket, which was opened in 1956. It's an early example of supermarkets in Australia. It was designed by Ernest Fuchs. The supermarket was commissioned by solicitors Joseph and Stella Shayton, and they asked him to convert the former Melbourne Victoria Theatre, built in 1920, into a modern facility offering shoppers convenience such as parking, childcare, and of course fresh produce. The image on the left is Fuchs's original exterior design, which is quite modern. However, the final scheme, which is on the right, incorporated the original facade of the theatre. The building is still there, by the way. It's now a Lincraft store. And here we have a floor plan, and there were a few different versions of the layout. An interview in the Argus said that the supermarket was going to have 35 modern stalls, they called it, like the one on the right. But when it was built, it ended up having 9 large stalls, 23 lock-up shops and parking. Unfortunately, the Shaytons had difficulty securing tenants for the stalls and shops, and by the end of 1956, they'd already sold us the site on to someone else, so it was a bit of a short-lived dream for them. I'll pass you back over to Harriet, who will talk about another emigre, Anatole Kagan.
Thanks, Simone. Yes, this is Anatole Kagan's story is different. We have a number of Viennese emigres in the collection, but Anatole was in fact born in St. Petersburg, and so he's Russian. But what's really interesting, when he was a young lad in 1922, he was about, I don't know, 8 or 9, something like that. His father was a very famous publisher, and he published really extraordinary, very important work. For example, he published the Nabokov, father and son, and works of that ilk, if you like. He was a Menshevik, so he had a political stance as well. And in 1922, Lenin had this brilliant idea that he'd actually get rid of all of the very clever people out of St. Petersburg and put them on a ship, which were called the philosopher ships, and send them all off to Germany. And the Weimar Republic, there being socialist, accepted these extraordinarily talented and brilliant people. And so the Kagans were shipped off to Berlin in 1922, and Anatole continued his schooling there, and he in fact did his architectural training at the Technical University in Berlin. So when he and his wife came to Melbourne in 1939, while he was Russian born, he was in fact a German architect. And I think sometimes we forget that. Now, what you can see on the screen, he set up, is on the left, a couple of his houses. He set up a private practice, which was very successful for about 20 years in Melbourne. And unlike Fuchs, he didn't really specialise in medium density housing. He specialised in single residences, really, and in the eastern, quite wealthy suburbs. So there are a number of his houses around still in queue, and they're highly prized by modernist enthusiasts, not only as objects, but also to buy and to live in. But on the right is a fascinating document that I've been obsessed by for many, many years now, and I sort of can't work out what to do with it. It's very, very beautiful. It's one of a series of notebooks that Kagan began to fill after Stalin's death, when Khrushchev started his de-Stalinization campaign. And Kagan was a communist, he was a Trotskyite. And what he started to do was to build or to design in these notebooks, initially from maps and reading. He hadn't been to St. Petersburg for 40 years since leaving as a child. He started to design this utopian city of St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it then was. And what he did was, because Leningrad, of course, was bombed to smithereens in the war, so he sort of reconstituted the city, but he did more than that. He designed it, he went back to its classical roots of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. And so he reinstated all the buildings that had been bombed. He reinstated those. But further than that, if buildings had been started by Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, he completed them. And then in the late 19th century, when Russian architecture went through a sort of a nationalistic phase, and they sort of turned their back on the classical, which is of course Western, that Peter and Catherine had brought into Russia, and they went back to their sort of vernacular architecture, which was really identified with Moscow, if you think of the Kremlin and domes and things like that. And so a few architects in Leningrad started designing these nationalistic buildings, which was very much in vogue in the 1890s. Anyway, Kagan clearly didn't like these at all, so he expunged them from the map of Leningrad and took them all off and built his own little sort of sanctuary where all of these discarded buildings would be. And he continued to design this city, which was entirely classical, but his version of classical. It was a completely utopian project for someone who had been expelled from the country when he was a little boy and had seen his father, who's very eminent, expelled as well. And I just think that this document here and the related documents tell you so much about the whole experience of migration and displacement. I mean, they're very, very powerful, quite apart from being very beautiful documents. Thanks, Simone.
Thank you, Harriet. And I'll just pass over to Anne, who will speak about Bernice Harris. Anne, I think you're on mute.
Apologies. Here we are. There's a photograph of Bernice Harris in the at the top of this slide, and she's sitting there in the office with Frederick Romberg behind her. Bernice Harris studied architecture at Melbourne Technical College during the Second World War, finally completing her degree in the 1950s. She joined Frederick Romberg's office in 1947 and worked with him, with a few interruptions, for almost 30 years in different practices. Now, below on the left-hand side, you can see a drawing that Harris did for the alterations to the kitchen and dining room of Pelican House at Mount Eliza. This house was originally designed by Robin Boyd in 1955 to 1957 for Prudence and Kenneth Meyer. It was, you might recall it, it was very notable for its roof, which was often described as a parasol shading the house. Harris worked with Robin Boyd for 18 years, initially with Grounds Romberg and Boyd, and then with Romberg and Boyd. And the latter practice she became a director of in 1964. So when Boyd suddenly died in 1971, Harris and Romberg finalised his outstanding projects. And this commission would have come after that time. So you can see her superb drafting skills and design skills in both of these drawings. The second drawing dates from the period when she'd actually left, her partnership with Romberg ended in 1975, and she established an independent practice. And this is a drawing for renovations to the University of Melbourne boat shed, which she did it was a 2-storey renovation. During her time in private practice, she did residential projects, additions and alterations. The Harris archive we have is a small archive, but it's a fascinating insight into the role of Bernice in these very significant architectural practices, and gives us a bit of a window into her contribution, which is believed to be quite substantial in terms of her management of contracts, drafting skills, and also design skills. And one of the things that's a little bit frustrating for us at the moment is that we're relying on the material that we have already digitised, and we can't just hop down to the store and have a look through some of the other documents we have relating to Berenice's career. And it's certainly on my list when I get back into the archives to have a look at more of her archive in our possession. Now I'm going to hand over to Simone Rule, who's going to talk about Illalooka House on the Mornington Peninsula.
Thank you, Anne. A little bit of a tangent away from architecture, or with architecture and collaborative practice. A lot of our collections are interlinked, as Harriet was talking before, and when you put them together, they're a real window into collaborative creative practice in Melbourne and how different designers worked together. An example of this is what we can see here in the photograph of Illalooka House here by Roy Grounds. It was designed by Roy Grounds, and in the picture are curtains of fabric designed by fabric designer Francis Burke. And Francis was often commissioned by architects to create fabrics to furnish interiors of their buildings. She was best known for house furnishings, but she also did larger projects like hospitals, libraries and theatres. In fact, the Canberra Theatre has just put back up their safety curtain with her black opal fabric, which you can see on their Facebook. It's really quite striking. And what Frances often did was reimagine her textile designs by moving motifs around or mixing and matching them with other designs. And if you look here, she's taken the leaves from oak leaf, which is the pink fabric in the top left corner, and repositioned them to look like seaweed. And then she's taken tiger stripe, the fabric on the bottom left, and used to create a water pattern to create an entirely new design. And you see this mixing and matching of motifs a lot through her designs. I think it was quite ingenious, really, just to take what she already had and bring new life into it. I'll pass you over to Anne now to have our last one, the South Bank Pedestrian Bridge.
Yes, so this is our last slide for the day. This is the South Bank Pedestrian Bridge. In the early 1980s, the Age newspaper started a campaign which was Give the Yarra a Go, and it aimed at creating public awareness of the Yarra River landscape and encouraging bicycle and pedestrian paths across the river. So this is Cox, Carmichael's and Whitford's 1987 scheme, and it shows the decking. It shows this kind of rather bucolic idea of the Yarra River, which this part of the river is, as you can see, just down from Princess Bridge, and it's near the Flinders Street Station precinct. And in this image of it, you can see that the undeveloped South Bank area. So this was planned prior to all the development on South Bank. And I've yet to see yachts sailing up and down the Yarra River at that point. However, it's just a lovely view of a rejuvenated Yarra River. It's had lots of names, this bridge. It's been called the Coat Hanger Bridge and the Lovelock Bridge. Its actually official title is the Evan Walker Bridge, which is a tribute to the planning minister, Evan Walker, who steered the development of the South Bank of the Yarra. It's very much an enduring and much loved feature of the Melbourne skyline. So I'm now going to hand over to Paula Towle, who's head of RMIT Culture, and she'll say a few words.
Thanks so much, Anne. I'm Paula Towle. I am the head of RMIT Culture, which is a fabulous collection of the cultural assets at RMIT, including the gallery and the archive and the design hub gallery. I really want to thank Harriet and Anne and Simone for that amazing talk. Every time I listen to these wonderful women speak about our archive, I learn fascinating new things, and I hope all of you have enjoyed this very much. You can go onto the site there that you'll see a link to, and you can sign up to join the mailing list for the Design Archive, and that will also give you an opportunity to sign up down the track if you want to learn more about RMIT Culture and the other programs and collections. And I might give everyone just a brief moment to pause and stretch your legs, grab a cuppa if you like, and we'll be back in about 8 minutes' time to kick off the launch of our 10th edition of the RMIT Design Journal. So thanks again, and we'll be welcoming all of the contributors for this next session to speak about their contributions to the 10th edition of the journal, and have a bit more Q&A around that later on.